Before we begin, I should say that we will be taking the next 2 weeks off, the week before Christmas and then the week after Christmas. I had planned for a month and a half now to take the week of Christmas off because the next day, Thursday, is Christmas Eve. But then I decided last week that I really needed a 2-week space because right now I'm running the gauntlet to Christmas Eve and then the week beyond that. And so, frankly, I need 2 weeks to regroup. That being said, this week we are considering the 24th chapter of Genesis. I've entitled this lesson, A Wife for Isaac. And as I said earlier, this is a longer lesson, and I'm not going to make it over long. There are some parts that we're going to have to skip over or scan over, but it's the longest chapter in all of Genesis. In fact, it's the 8th longest chapter in all of the Bible. It contains an intact novella or short story from the Yahwist source and was likely put to parchment during the post-exilic period, which is 597 through 539. And it's precisely because it is an intact short story that we can't divide it up and parse it out. It is not really episodic. One thing flows to another. There are transitions in the story, but it isn't the kind of story that you can really cut in half or take in 2 days. And so I decided that we should go and do the entire thing, which means we'll be doing quite a bit of reading from the text. We skipped over chapter 23, which tells of Sarah's death at the ripe old age of 127. Abraham is able to purchase a tomb for her along with a plot of land from the Hittites, who in this story exhibit great deference and respect for Abraham. If you want to read about that for yourselves, you can read chapter 23. Our story today opens up with our good friend Abraham taking the initiative to procure a wife for his son Isaac. And if you read on to chapter 25, you will discover that he is aged 40 at this point. He being Isaac is aged 40, which is a late age to be married in those days, which is why Abraham perhaps is taking the initiative. Can't wait any longer. It's time for Isaac to get hitched. Aside from making direct observations about today's text, which we will do, I thought it a good opportunity to explore the topic of marriage in the biblical world, broadly speaking, specifically the world of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. It may come as a surprise that there are very few passages in the Bible that detail marital arrangements and how they were made. This chapter is perhaps the most detailed account of an arranged marriage in the Hebrew Bible, if not the most detailed account. And so I thought it was a good opportunity to talk about how people got married back in the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then in the centuries to follow. One of the books that I rely heavily on in this lesson is called Women's Lives in Biblical Times by Ginny R. Ebeling. This is an excellent book, and I highly recommend it. It is a book in 2 parts that run parallel to one another. One part is a fictional narrative of a young girl that grows into a woman named Orpah. And then the part that runs parallel to that narrative is a sociological, historical recounting of the practices and customs of those times. And so you get a realistic narrative of what it would be like to be a woman growing up in these times, and then an explanation to help you better understand what is going on in there. And there's a whole chapter about marriage in the time of the patriarchs, and specifically in the time of Rebecca and Isaac, whose story we'll be considering today. And I'd like to begin with a longer reading from this book, from page 82. She writes, "The Hebrew Bible, our primary source for reconstructing marriage arrangements and wedding customs in ancient Israel, does not provide clear guidelines for marriage. Arrangements were usually initiated by the parents." And he gives a few scripture references here, including today's story. And the first reference to parentally arranged marriage is when Hagar selects a wife for her son Ishmael from Egypt. This story also demonstrates that women and men were married relatively young, as Ishmael must have been a teenager when his mother arranged his marriage, although sometimes men married when they were older, as is the case with Isaac today. Before I finish this reading, I will add that for girls, for young women / girls, it was customary for them to marry a few years after they started their menstrual cycles. And so you may think of Rebecca in this story as perhaps a 15-year-old, 16-year-old, around in there. There are a number of other instances in which women were directly involved in matchmaking, showing that mothers had some authority in this matter. In other passages, men are directly involved in their own marriage negotiations, such as Samson, who demands that his parents arrange for his marriage to a Philistine woman. Other special arrangements, like levirate marriages, when a woman marries her dead husband's brother so that her husband's line may continue, are also described by the biblical writers. And I found these two illustrations of the same picture with different captions. The first I thought was kind of spot on with this story, right? You have Yahweh directing the servant to the right place, the right time, and all the pieces fit. I think the one on my right, probably your right on your screen, how you should meet your spouse, is a bit much. I don't think this is prescriptive. I don't think very many of us had their parents send a servant to a faraway land to meet up at a well and et cetera, et cetera. I just thought it was kind of funny, so I included it. So we'll get to the text. Chapter 24, verse 1. Now, Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his house, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live, but will go to my country and to my kindred and get a wife for my son Isaac. The above-mentioned servant may be Eliezer, who Abraham had thought might inherit all that he possessed in light of his not having an heir back in chapter 15. All of the biblical commentators that I read speculated that this might be who we are to have in mind. We cannot know for certain, but it's plausible. It is clear rather, that Abraham does not want his son to marry the Canaanites. So he sends his servant to the land from which he came to find a wife from his own relatives. This alludes to a common cultural practice in those days. Ebeling writes, the ideal marriage was endogamous, or made within the large group. In the Iron Age, this probably meant that a man or a woman from the same tribe would ideally be married. Marriage with a foreigner was considered dangerous, as in the case of Solomon, whose many foreign wives worshipped deities other than Yahweh. So this is part and parcel with the customs of the time. Take from that what you will. But this was normative practice in the Iron Age and in the times that these stories are said to have occurred. Lastly, we must really address the strange command of Abraham in verses 2-3. Put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth. I chose to quote, I being Heath, chose to quote from the HarperCollins Study Bible Commentary to elucidate what's going on here, as this commentary put things clearly, but more politely than some of the others I read. Put your hand under my thigh, and I'm quoting here, put your hand under my thigh, a ritual component of the servant's oath that seems to signify, either literally or by proximity, Abraham's reproductive organ, an appropriate source of authority for the patriarch. It's from Handel, page 36. In other words, my paraphrase, here is an oath made on or around Abraham's genitals, the source of his offspring and therefore his future. And I couldn't find a picture of that, naturally. So I shouldn't have, and I'm glad I didn't, but I just say I would rather swear on a Bible. So, but in the context of this story, it's Abraham having the servant swear on his future. It's a big promise. It just, again, different cultures, different times, comes off as very, very strange. But the important idea is the servant is promising on Abraham's future that he will do this thing on behalf of Abraham's future. So, verse 5, the servant said to him, perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham said to him, see to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there. So the servant put his right hand under the thigh of Abraham, his master, and swore to him concerning the matter. First, Abraham is adamant that his son not return to the land that he had left back in Genesis chapter 12. Perhaps he is afraid that his son will stay in the land and not inhabit the land the Lord had promised. Fritham writes in the New Interpreter's Bible commentary, the author explains in verse 7 the twice expressed concern that Isaac not be brought back. For Isaac to settle in the place from which Abraham migrated would be untrue to God's call and the promise for the land. Maybe Abraham is afraid that his son Isaac will settle down there and basically the family will find themselves back where they had begun. Also, I need to note that Abraham is confident that his servant will find a wife for his son. This is why he says you'll be free of the oath if you go there and she won't come back with you. But Abraham in his mind is confident that the servant will find a wife for Isaac. And why shouldn't he feel that confident? After all, in the last chapter, we read about how when he took his son up to Mount Moriah, the Lord provided a ram. At this point in his life, he has learned that the Lord will provide. In this chapter 24, the longest chapter in Genesis, is the son coming to understand this as well. Also notice verse 8. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, this is a great courtesy Abraham is extending to Isaac's future wife. We will come back to this theme of a woman's consent to marriage a bit later, but in these days, a woman's consent to marriage was by no means something that you could take for granted. And in fact, it seems that Rebecca's family assumes that they have the right to give her away. At least Laban, her brother, does, and her father. We'll get to that in a little bit. Verse 10. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed, taking all kinds of choice gifts from his master. And he set out and went to Aram Naharaim, to the city of Nahor. He made camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water. It was toward evening, the time when women go out to draw water. And he said, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. I am standing here by the spring of water, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. Let the girl to whom I shall say, please offer your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels. Let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. What I, Heath Jones, like most about the servant's petition is the immediate access he assumes between him and Yahweh. Up until now, we are quite used to special personages of high status, like your Abrahams or your Melchizedeks, having this kind of pull with the divine. But here we have a lowly servant addressing God directly. This fits a theme common in other biblical texts, the lowly elevated by access to divine direction. For example, Hagar back in Genesis chapter 16, or Mary and Joseph in the Gospels is another example fitting this model. The point, all persons have access to God. Fritham writes in the New Interpreter's Bible commentary, the servant remains anonymous, subservient to the divine action in the life of his family. The servant illustrates what life is like for many servants of God. They enter into the service of their master and proceed faithfully in quite ordinary situations, remaining anonymous in the overall scheme of things. Yet they are crucial vehicles for the leading and blessing work of God in daily affairs. In other words, don't take anything you do for granted, because we are all being used for the good of humanity and for the purposes of God, even those whose names are lost to history. And I like that. Verse 15. Before he had finished speaking, there was Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, coming out with her water jar on her shoulder. The girl was very fair to look upon, a virgin whom no man had known. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, "Please, let me sip a little water from your jar." "Drink, my lord," she said, and quickly lowered her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. When she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I will draw for your camels also until they have finished drinking." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran again to the well to draw, and she drew for all his camels. The man gazed at her in silence to learn whether or not the Lord had made his journey successful. The description of Rebecca in verses 15 through 16 are meant to cue the reader before the servant even knows it, to cue in the reader into the reality that who we have here is truly the perfect match, at least on paper. Good family, check. A looker, check. A virgin, double check. And why I say virgin, double check is because of what Ebeling writes in her book. She writes, "A wife's sexuality belongs exclusively to her husband, and the law demanded that wives be virgins. If an unmarried girl is guilty of sex before marriage, it is a crime against her father. If she is married, it is a crime against her husband." And Heath Jones, I'll add as an aside, breaking the quote for a second, that it's a crime against the men in her life and never against her in this world. Back to the quote. "Adultery involving a married woman was a crime of the first magnitude in Israelite law, ranking with murder and major religious offenses as a transgression, demanding the death penalty for both offenders. Although several passages state that a man who has sex with a married woman is to be killed, men were not restricted from relations with prostitutes and could also have multiple wives and concubines." So some women of lower status who were not, I guess, marriage material, found themselves in roles of prostitution. And it was not against the law for the men to take the prostitutes or to have multiple wives or concubines. But a young girl whose purpose was to be married and have babies, her virginity was to be kept by the father first, and then was the property of the husband. Again, take that from that what you will. It's the way that things were in these times. Verse 22, "When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold nose ring weighing a half shekel and 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels and said, 'Tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?' She said to him, 'I am the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor.' She added, 'We have plenty of straw and fodder and a place to spend the night.' The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord and said, 'Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on the way to the house of my master's kin.'" So the servant now knows immediately that this is the woman for Isaac. Rebecca has shown herself to be a person who practices radical hospitality. It is no small feat to water 10 camels. Not only is Rebecca a good wife on paper, she has demonstrated that she is a person of high moral character. Consequently, he gives her the bride price. More on this in a second. That's the nose rings and all of the gold bracelets. He gives that to her immediately, placing heavy gold jewelry on her and apparently piercing her nose. And just when things can't get any better, she tells him whose family she's from in verse 24. Now Yahweh's just piling on the blessing. The servant thanks God. Williamson writes, quoting J. Gerald Jansen, J. Gerald Jansen points out that a meeting at a well is often a type scene of promise and generativity. And lists several examples here. One we're considering now. No, actually, the one that comes next, Rachel and Jacob, the son of Isaac and Rebekah, Zipporah and Moses, and the Samaritan woman and Jesus. These are places where life-giving activity and messages are found at wells. Rebekah appeared at the well, continuing the quote, and exhibited hospitality toward the servant similar to that of Sarah and Abraham toward the visitors at Mamre, reminding the reader of the theological potential of welcoming strangers and revealing Rebecca to be of the same stuff as the ancestral couple. And so now she herself, Rebecca, is entering into the narrative and the tradition of Abraham and Sarah, who once entertained angels and even God's self, and did not know it. And Rebecca is showing that she is cut from that same cloth, showing that same kind of hospitality to the stranger. So she is a suitable wife, to say the least. Verse 28. Then the girl ran and told her mother's household about these things. Rebecca had a brother whose name was Laban. Thus enters Laban, and he will be an important character in the stories that follow with their child Jacob. More on that in coming weeks and months. But I digress. Verse 29, Rebecca had a brother whose name was Laban, and Laban ran out to the spring. As soon as he had seen the nose ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms, and when he heard the words of his sister Rebecca, thus the man spoke to me, he went to the man, and there he was, standing by the camels at the spring. He said, "Come in, O blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside when I have prepared the house and a place for the camels?" So the man came into the house, and Laban unloaded the camels and gave him straw and fodder for the camels, and water to wash his feet and the feet of the men who were with him. Then food was set before him to eat, but he said, "I will not eat until I have told my errand." He being Laban, said, "Speak on." Laban speaks more than his father in this story by a long shot. Presumably, his father, Bethuel, is the master of the house, but Laban takes a leading role. It is a bit unclear how closely related these people are to Abraham. It seems like it is more clear in this English translation, but in the Hebrew, the relations between these personages is somewhat vague. Fritham writes, relationships in Rebecca's family are not easy to discern, but the following seems likely. Rebecca is the granddaughter of Nahor, Abraham's brother. Her father, Bethuel, and Isaac are cousins, which would make Isaac and Rebecca, I guess, second cousins, I think. Second, she's a distant cousin of some kind. Near-ish / distant cousin, second or third cousin, which was perfectly acceptable and fine in those days. In verses 34 through 49, and this is the part we will skip over, because the servant relates to Laban all that happened up to this point, and his recounting of events is so similar, almost exact quotes of what we read earlier, that we can just skip on ahead to what happens after he explains to Laban what has transpired by the well with the camels in the water. So picking up at verse 50. Then Laban and Bethuel answered, "The things come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you anything bad or good. Look, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken." Laban and Bethuel's answer in verse 50 indicates that they acknowledge that Rebekah's marriage to Isaac is the will of God. So they have nothing bad or good to say about it. It's as if they have reconciled to it as if it were an incontrovertible and inevitable fact. Also notice that the choice is made here by the men. This was in keeping with the customs of the times. However, in this instance, as we will soon discover, Rebecca is not completely shut out of the decision. In fact, she is given an opportunity to voice her desire as it relates to the timing of her departure. Verse 52. When Abraham's servant heard their words, he bowed himself to the ground before the Lord. And the servant brought out jewelry of silver and gold and garments and gave them to Rebekah. He also gave to her brother and to her mother costly ornaments. Then he and the men who were with him ate and drank, and they spent the night there. When they rose in the morning, he said, "Send me back to my master." Her brother and her mother said, "Let the girl remain with us a while, at least 10 days. After that, she may go." But he said to them, "Do not delay me, since the Lord has made my journey successful. Let me go, that I may go to my master." They said, "We will call the girl and ask her." And they called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" She said, I will. Rebekah's answer in verse 28 is meant to echo and does echo Abraham's answer in Genesis chapter 12, when he was asked to leave this very geographic location, this spot on the map, for the land God would show him. Now, Rebekah, the next generation, falls into this tradition and this narrative, walking the very way her future father-in-law did so long ago to the land that her future father-in-law now inhabits. This indicates that Rebekah truly is called to this purpose and is a woman who shares in the faith of Abraham and the promises that God has made to Abraham and the hope that God has given Abraham for his future and for the future of his offspring. Hope for more babies and more in a land that they can call their own. I also note that verse 55 alludes to a cultural practice of preparing the bride for her wedding, which in this case would take at least 10 days, and which is what they're asking for. But the servant is anxious to return to his master to share all that has transpired. And so they ask Rebekah what she would like to do, and she says that she's ready to go. Verse 59, so they sent away their sister Rebekah and her nurse, along with Abraham's servant and his men, and they blessed Rebekah and said to her, may you, our sister, become thousands of myriads. May your offspring gain possession of the gates of their foes. Then Rebekah and her maids rose up, mounted the camels, and followed the man. Thus the servant took Rebekah and went on his way. Off to your right, I have a short quote from Ebeling. Farewell songs were apparently sung as women left her birth house for her husband's house, such as when Rebekah sets off for Canaan to marry Isaac. And here we have a snippet of the farewell song. May you, our sister, become thousands of myriads. May your offspring gain possession of the gates of their foes. And so we are meant to imagine them singing this as they are making their exit. Ebeling also writes of what's happening here. Once a woman married and moved to her husband's village, it was expected that she would live there for the rest of her life. Of course, there were circumstances that led to less than ideal situations, such as early widowhood, and these were usually resolved by the husband's family. Divorce was probably infrequent in the early Iron Age, and if it occurred, it may have been a male prerogative. The divorced or deserted wife would probably then return to her father's household, since a woman usually owned no property. She was reliant on her father before marriage and on her husband after. And here I have an extended quote. This is all one continuous reading from 2 pages in the book that I think helps us understand what is happening here in the story that we have just read as a cultural practice. She writes, even though mothers could be involved in marriage negotiations, the language used in the arrangements is male. A woman is given, taken, sent for, captured, or even purchased in the case of a slave woman. There are biblical passages that depict women as chattel, such as Exodus 20, verse 17, where wives, children, slaves, and livestock are listed as a man's major possessions. Women are also described as war booty, and wives are counted along with concubines, silver, and gold as an index of a man's wealth. Women were not simply property that could be bought and sold, however, and nowhere is a man's absolute sovereignty over his wife indicated in the biblical text. An important part of the marriage arrangements was setting the dowry and bride price. The dowry, or shilitim, was given by the bride to her new husband's family, and the bride price, mohar, was intended to compensate the bride's family for the loss of her economic contributions to her husband's household. I'll pause here and note that in this story, we have a very clear example of the bride price, all that the servant gives to first Rebekah and then later to the family. He comes prepared to give this bride price. We don't really see the dowry coming through in a big way in this story, but it was customary for there to be a dowry, wealth or animals or even land in some instances, as we'll read here in a second, that would go along with the bride. So I'll continue reading. The dowry could include gifts of land, such as when Solomon married an Egyptian princess and was given the city of Gezer by her father, the Pharaoh. Giving land was probably a practice reserved for royals and the wealthy. However, unusual requests, such as when Saul asks David to bring 100 Philistine foreskins for the hand of Saul's daughter, Michal, are also described. Shechem offers Jacob anything he wants in exchange for his daughter, Dinah, after Shechem rapes and presumably falls in love with her. More commonly, perhaps, jewelry was exchanged between the two families, such as in the story of Rebekah. The servants were also given as gifts. Exchanging gifts helped create or maintain the relationship between the two families, which would create mutual obligations in case one family needed assistance in the future. The marriage arrangement was thus an agreement made between two families, and the wife's rights within the marriage would have depended on her family's ability to support her demands. Thus, the daughter of a rich or powerful man would have higher status than the daughter of a poor man and could possibly expect better treatment. Several biblical passages show that young brides were not totally passive or lacking initiative in the marriage arrangements. However, and a woman could refuse an offer or make demands. When Rebekah's marriage with Isaac is being arranged, for example, Rebekah is asked by her mother and brother if she will go to Canaan to marry him willingly. They said, "We will call the girl and ask her." And they called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" She said, "I will." After she agreed to marry Isaac, Rebekah and her nurse left for Canaan with Abraham's servant and his men. Now, she isn't writing specifically about this story that we're considering today, but it does keep coming up because it is the clearest, or if not the clearest, one of the most clear stories that highlights the way that marriages were arranged in these days. And in some cases, as Ebeling points out, the bride doesn't seem to have much, if any, say. And then in other cases, the bride does have at least some say. And to what degree she could push that, we're not really sure. In this case, she was agreeable to the terms, and so she went with the servant in agreement. So I guess it would largely depend probably on the family and the nature of the deal being brokered. And I do mean deal because, as you see, these were also ways of forming binding contracts between families in exchange for land or protection. If one family is attacked by a warring tribe, perhaps it could rely on the in-laws to help them out in a pinch. And so these were ways of shoring up relations between larger family units to ensure survival of multiple family units as they would cooperate and make contractual marriages like the one that we're reading about here. That was the way it was done. And it reminds me remarkably of the kinds of marriages you read about in medieval Europe, to be honest with you, at least amongst the very wealthy houses, the way that they thought about marriages. So it's not without parallels in even more modern times. But here we come to the conclusion of the story. Verse 62. Now Isaac had come to Beer Laharoi and was settled in the Negeb. Isaac went out in the evening to walk in the field, and looking up, he saw camels coming. And Rebekah looked up. And when she saw Isaac, she slipped quickly from the camel and said to the servant, "Who is the man over there walking in the field to meet us?" The servant said, "It is my master." So she took her veil and covered herself. And the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent. He took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. The soon-to-be happy couple meet. And we do not know the significance of Rebekah's covering her face. Hybert writes in the Common English Bible commentary, the purpose of Rebekah's headscarf is unclear. Veiling isn't mentioned as customary for married women in biblical society. So perhaps she is just trying to, maybe she's a bit shy, or maybe she's not quite ready to make his acquaintance. We don't know what to really make of the veil or the covering. But and again, it's just kind of an interesting detail of the story. We discover at the end of the saga that Isaac was deep in grief over the death of his mother, and that he finds comfort in his new wife. In fact, we read that he loved her, which was by no means expected. It's great when the spouses in biblical marriages are loved by one another, but it isn't a prerequisite for marriage, and it certainly isn't absolutely necessary, as we will read in the very next set of marriage stories as it relates to Jacob and his first wife Leah, and then Rachel. We'll see that love is not always to be assumed between married persons in the biblical world. A romantic idea is a more modern concept, truthfully speaking. So some takeaways, and I kept these very short because this has been a long lesson up to this point. So some bullet points, I guess. And this first is a quote from Hamilton in his commentary on the Old Testament. He writes, Genesis 24, God will provide. Abraham discovered this at Moriah. God provided a ram. Will God now provide a wife for Isaac? The longest chapter in Genesis is devoted to answering this question. For Abraham, there is no doubt that the answer to this question is an unqualified yes. Inspired by his master's faith, the servant too places the search in God's hands. Nothing of chance or coincidence is allowed to intrude. For this union, God has chosen/appointed a wife. Me speaking, I very much like the parallels made between Abraham's journey of faith and Rebekah's. She is presented with an opportunity, perhaps she had a choice, to leave her home, as did Abraham, and walk the path that Abraham has walked. She answers the call simply, I will. I like that. I like how Rebekah is given a chance to enter into the narrative in the same spirit and with the same faith as Abraham. I also very much like the way the servant serves as the one who brings about God's promises. He converses with God and becomes the one who helps facilitate God's plan for Abraham, Isaac, and Rebekah. The nameless slave is shown to be a holy vessel and serves a prophetic role in this story. And then my last point, I guess, is more of a comment and not really a point. Marriage was certainly different during the Iron Age, to say the least. Marriage was different. These are my sources. And again, I will give one last plug for Ginny Ebeling's book, Women's Lives in Biblical Times. It's an excellent read and very, very well written, but also very informative. So I will open it up for discussion. Or what did you notice as we were going through the story, or what stuck out to you?
I think I was kind of surprised. I thought when Abraham was called, the nation around him didn't recognize God. But from what we just read, they know all about God too.
Yeah. Different Abraham stories seem to make different assumptions about the peoples around them. For example, in chapter 23, I noted that the Hittites seem to have a very good rapport with Abraham. But then in other Abrahamic stories or stories about his children, they do not. It really depends on the source material that's being used and woven into the narrative. In this story, they go back and they're using Yahweh language. Laban, they are naming the God of Israel, the God of, will be the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, at least at this point. Yeah, very, very good observation.
Have we heard this name Laban before?
I think he might have been dropped in a genealogy.
Okay. That's probably right.
I don't know that he is. I get him confused with Lamech, but I don't know that. I'm looking it up right now. See where he's mentioned, but I kind of have that same feeling you do. My memory is not perfect, and I do sometimes forget the details of even lessons in the past that we've gone through. So let me see here.
You certainly know about him when he gets to Jacob.
Yeah. And what's funny is Abraham's intuition seems to have been correct. You don't want your kids to settle down and get stuck back in the old land, because that is precisely what happens to Jacob. Although he comes off better for it. No, this is the first mention of him.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, this is the first mention. And then he's mentioned repeatedly on through the Jacob stories up through, yeah.
I like your takeaway, about the slave, the unknown, the unnamed person who played a prophetic role. I think about all the unnamed people around here. Who are they who played a prophetic role in our lives today?
Yeah, some parts of the Bible, it seems like, in the Moses stories, it's like Moses and sometimes Aaron. It's like they are the conduit. They are the touch point, right? And so we hear so many stories like that, that stories like this that are more subtle, sometimes escape our notice, where you have the servant with no name just in his mind prays at a well and has this direct dialogue with Yahweh, and it doesn't even seem like a surprise. It doesn't seem out of the ordinary in this story. It doesn't strike me as that way anyway, or especially unique. It just seems to be part of what the servant may be used to as it relates to talking to God.
And there was a lot of trust placed in that servant, that he was really taking on a huge task to go all that way and find this woman that was going to be Isaac's wife. And he said, well, if she doesn't want to come, that's okay. Don't kidnap her. But still, he had all this wealth with him, and it was 10 camels, and it was a lot. So he really trusted him. Abraham really trusted him. So.
Yeah, I basically, sometimes you can probably tell when I'm kind of unnerved or not exactly liking what I'm reading in the story. And, that's for me to deal with. I really like this story by and large. Given its time and its context and all of the assumptions about the role of women in their marriages, which I don't, they don't fit our modern context to say the very least. And I think they're problematic. But given the world and the context, we see a woman who seems to feel good about this marriage and wants to marry, and following all the rules of that culture, seems like she is given more of a voice in the decision to leave her childhood home, which would be, we don't ask that of our children today. They make those choices for themselves. But I like this. I like this story. And I especially like how Rebecca is given the opportunity to parallel Abraham's life out of that same land and into this larger narrative. I do find this interesting, and there is no answer for it that I could find. And it was noted by several commentators, and I don't know the answer to this. And I don't think it's answered in the biblical text. But you may remember, but back in the early chapters of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 2, it says, for this reason, the woman will leave, or the husband will leave his house into the house of the woman, right? He's going to leave his house and go into the woman's house. As a matter of fact, when I worked at a corn mill, we had an argument about this. This guy who was like a kind of he really liked to read the Bible, was like, no, the woman has to leave the man and go into the house of the man. But in the Genesis account, it says the precise opposite. But I know why he thought that, the man in the corn mill. It's because that is the way it always seems to work after the fact. As soon as we get out of the garden, it just seems that the woman always goes out and joins the household of whoever she marries. And I have no explanation for that. There's no commentary. There's no commentary within the scripture about why that is the case. There's no pivotal moment in the narrative where it just suddenly changes. It just seems to be the assumed way of doing things by the time the Torah was compiled. And it's really, I only bring that up because I found that interesting.
Now, my footnote says that leaves the father and the mother instead of remaining under protective custody of his parents. The man leaves them and, with his wife, established a new family unit.
That could be true in some cases. In the case that we read even today, you have Laban living with Bethuel. You have, although have taken a leadership role there, but you have Isaac going back to the home of Abraham, and then later you have Jacob does have to leave the home, but for different reasons, and Esau staying around. But it seems to be when the patriarch dies that the next in line inherits all of the land, and the wealth of their forebears, and then carries on in that way. But we certainly don't see in this story the pattern of, Laban didn't send Rebecca over to Abraham's house and bring Isaac back to that land. It didn't work that way. And I have nothing to add except for just to notice it as an interesting fact.
I have a question, Heath. What stood out to me was the whole thing about putting the ring on her nose at the well. And I just thought that was really odd that she didn't protest. What was that all about? Was that a marriage bid, or it just seemed odd to me. I would have been rather nervous if someone had just put this ring. It sound like it was a big ring.
I didn't have half a shekel weighs.
Yeah, kind of large, didn't it?
So what's funny, every commentary I read just skimmed over that fact and just wrote it all off as bride price stuff. And I was taken by that too. Like, what did he ask politely? May I pierce your nose now? Or did she already have a nose? Did she already have a nose piercing that she just like swapped one out for the other?
Exactly.
Yeah, sure.
Exactly what I'm thinking. Yes.
I know that in later Torah writings, one of the signs of a freed slave is a pierced ear, where the master will pierce the ear with a stake, and that will be a sign that slave has been freed. Now, I'm just speculating here, but maybe in a similar way, the pierced nose was a sign that a woman had a claim of betrothal made on her. That's a guess, because it was so weird that I had about 6 books that I was going through and cross-referencing this and went through this story, and I was especially hoping for some answers in the lives of biblical women that I keep bringing up. And they talked a lot about bride price, but they didn't seem as fixated on the nose piercing. But I noticed that too.
I would have noticed.
Did it say piercing? Did it say piercing, or does it just say placed a nose, a ring in her nose? And I guess I just kind of thought that maybe it was a circle that just bent a little, and they just put it on each side of the nose.
It doesn't specify piercing. It doesn't. Let me see.
I don't know if it says, mine doesn't say piercing, but
it says placed a nose ring on her is what mine says, I think. Placed a nose ring.
Here it is.
I put the ring. I put it on her nose.
Yeah,
put
a gold ring. Put a gold nose ring. So that's 22.
And 2 bracelets for her arms too. So
yeah,
and those were considerably
the weight,
heavier.
10 gold shekels. Like there's a weight to them. So
yeah.
This footnote doesn't have anything.
It says this is the first thing. This is gotquestions.org. I don't take this as in any way authoritative. Okay, so with that caveat, this would be, if I were going to put this in a paper on the subject,
right.
This would be bad. So that being owned, this website reads, to the question, what does the Bible say about nose rings or getting a nose ring? Which you can imagine that question posed by an angsty teenager wanting her parents to sign off.
Or a tattoo.
Yeah, right. Gosh, I'm reliving my childhood. Answer. Nose rings are mentioned in the Bible as far back as the book of Genesis, when Abraham sent his servant in search of a wife for Isaac. The servant prayed that God would reveal to him the right, etc., etc. We know all this. Rebecca came in answer to his prayer, and when she agreed to give him lodging in her father's home, he gave her some. Again, we know all this. Among these gifts was a gold nose ring. Verse 22. This reveals that nose rings were in fashion. I don't know that it does. This reveals that nose rings were in fashion during the era, and they represented wealth and status when given as gifts. They were also considered female attire. The only time men wore anything through their noses was when they were taken as slaves in Second Chronicles. So I guess we just, from the biblical record alone, don't know. But I do think I don't know that I could infer from this story that they were in fashion during the era. Although it's I guess a plausible guess. But we can gather that it's meant to be a bestowing of honor on Rebecca, given the context of all this gold. And it certainly is meant to elevate her. So maybe it's as simple as nose rings were in at the time and Abraham did his research. I don't know.
But was it, so it seems to be in the context of him asking for lodging, whose daughter are you, he says, and asking for lodging. So it doesn't seem to be specifically in terms of, asking her if she'll be the wife of someone. So I don't know. I get that they don't say, but.
And there are more gifts given after the fact that are clearly meant to be the bride price. So,
right. So, but then they mention it again later when he talks about when he's recounting his story to dad and the brothers, that he put the nose ring in. So I don't know. I get that we don't know, but it still seems just strange. So anyway.
Yeah.
Fun discussion.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And I'm glad we got through this as quickly as we did. I was worried that it would be so long that it would be somewhat of a tedious lesson. But I really like this story. And so if you read that passage where the servant's recounting to Laban and Bethuel the story, it is like the same thing. It's like almost a direct line by line quote retelling, which is a common literary form. I read in the commentaries. It was common literary form to repeat in storytelling through the voices of other characters, the same sort of thing.
I really appreciate you bringing out details. I'm learning all this new stuff, like placing my hand under the thigh and one near his genitals. And your images, it's just been wonderful, Heath. All the different times that you brought up stuff that, like most people like me, would just kind of skim over and not even bother to think about it. But those details are important. It brings life and context, and I really like it.
Yeah,
Thank you
For that compliment. I couldn't let a phrase like he asked his servant to place his hand under his thigh. I couldn't let that sentence go without some question. It did mean, and this was agreed in every commentary I read, near or around the genitals being the point, not in any kind of sexualized way, but as the source of future generations. That's the point. It makes sense, and it just would be frowned upon these days.
But that's the point. That's their whole thing. Abraham is the generator of the future generations. He's it. He's
like circumcision.
The father. Yeah.
Like circumcision, when it's explained, and it fits, and it makes the oath very powerful. I'm swearing on all of my future kids and their kids. So I want you, servant, to swear that you will do this on all of I'm putting up my future kids and grandkids on the line, that you will follow through with what I'm asking you to do. Yeah. Shows a great trust. So. Oh, thank you. Somehow we end up talking a lot about these things in these Bible lessons. These things meaning genitals. But it's I'm not trying to be crass so much. It is funny to say that, but it comes up because these circumcision stories, the story like we just read, it's in that world, they weren't as doesn't seem like they were quite as they wouldn't have written it down if it were embarrassing to them. Let's just put it that way. It's our own cultural lens that we're bringing into it when we're kind of feels funny, kind of weird,
They said it because it was meaningful for them.
Right.
Right.
Exactly right. It was
Yeah.
exactly right.
And
That's-
I think it's also kind of a reminder of how important the male was, the man of the family.
Yes,
Like-
that is the other thing. The man
Mhm.
gave the seed, and the seed was what made the baby. They didn't really
Yeah.
believe in those days that the woman's body was it was the vessel for what the seed did.
Right.
It wasn't so now we know that it's if the balance sways any direction, it's certainly I mean, come on, women who bear children do far more. I can't even understate it enough. It's but in those days it was this. That's why they say Abraham's seed. That was the cultural perspective. That was just
Right,
the word as they
right.
knew it.
But sort of the basis of the patriarchy, I think. I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but it's like the basis of the patriarchy, though. That was the power source, so to speak. But anyway.
Yeah, but
I
I think of when Jesus was conceived, it was without a man. So that was a really revolutionary thought that the Messiah would come like that. Not some people don't believe in the virgin birth, but I laughingly said, yeah, he was artificial insemination by God. But anyway, isn't that an interesting thing as we are approaching Christmas tide?
Yeah,
To think about it, yeah.
It is.
Well, that's a better note to end on right there. So I'm going to go ahead and sign out. Thank you all, and
Yes.
we'll see you soon. Some of you I'll see you on Saturday and then on Sunday. So take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Right.